Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the Office of Research Team Research Forum. This is our first session of this year, I believe. I am very delighted to welcome two of our star researchers on campus. I think a lot of us have seen a lot of press coverage about this project. We are going to be talking today about the role of scientific evidence in policy discussions, and in particular about this project led by Professor Raina Engle-Stone and Professor Emeritus Steve Vosti, looking into the role of scientific evidence in guiding fortification decisions and policy discussions with the Nigerian government. As always, please make sure that your microphones are off. I will go and mute your microphones if you accidentally turn it on. I recommend you keep your video off. You'll have a chance to turn your video back on when we get to the Q&A section. If during the session you have questions, I invite you to post them on the chat box so that we can bring them up at the end of the presentations. And with that, I am going to pass the microphone to Professor Steve Vosti to get us started with today's Team Research Forum presentations.
Okay, are we ready to rock? Okay, so let me share my screen here. Okay, can people see that? Oh, you're muted. You can't tell me.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Sounds good. Thanks for joining us. I'm not able to see all the names, but a few that I do see are familiar to me. So thanks, friends and colleagues for joining us for this. Raina and I are going to be speaking on behalf of a really large number of individuals who have been working on this project for the past 5 years or so. I assume full responsibility for the title, from outright rejection to hopeful embrace. But that's what we're going to be talking about. And in particular, we're going to be talking about the types of evidence that we generated at the request of different stakeholders over a fairly long period of time, 5 years or so, that led to what we consider a pretty big policy win. And again, we're speaking on behalf of really a very, very large number of individuals who have worked very hard over the past 5 years to generate and to deliver the evidence in convincing and impactful ways. The overview, I'm going to tell you what that policy win was in Nigeria, in the context of Nigeria. We'll talk a little bit about the motivation, but I think for most folks, especially in the nutrition domain, it doesn't take a lot of convincing. We'll talk about the partners and the very broad array of partners that were involved in this. We'll talk about the stakeholders and the questions that they pose to us. And then we'll talk about, the role of evidence in addressing these questions, because if you can't answer the questions, you're not going to get their buy-in. And we'll talk about how we produced it, what we produced, how we produced it, and then how we delivered it. The focus is going to be on essentially the integration of research and policy processes. And it was circular, as one could imagine, because the research program was designed and then modified as we went forward, especially in the context of modeling, to make sure that we could answer the questions that folks asked of us and kind of deliver the policy win that we had hoped to secure. And then we'll end with a few kind of ingredients for success that we distill from this particular 5-year exercise that I think are useful checkpoints for folks engaging in policy research that seeks to have an impact at the end of the day. This will be our presentation will be divided in 3 parts actually. I'll talk for a bit, who will talk about the RCT, and then I'll finish up at the end. We kind of want to end, or we want to begin at the end. These 2 documents, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's 2 documents, and these are kind of fairly boring 5-page documents that literally represent the policy win. And these were launched in September of 2024, and these are the sanctioned new Nigeria Code of Practice for bullion fortification and bullion manufacturing, and they include micronutrients. They're voluntary for now, but this is the first step in securing a mandatory fortification. Much of what we're going to be talking about today is this process between kind of 2019 and 24, and all the different studies that UC Davis in particular were researchers were engaged in. There are other studies that went on as well, and we'll make reference to those. In terms of our motivation, 1 out of every 2 children in developing countries has 1 or more micronutrient deficiencies, and 2 out of 3 women of reproductive age have 1 or more micronutrient deficiencies as well. This is a huge issue, remains a huge issue in the context of developing countries, and it has implications for mortality, child mortality in particular, and child growth, but also the development of children moving forward. And this is not a new issue. We've known about this for a long time, and in fact, there are most countries in certainly in sub-Saharan Africa and all of Latin America, have 1 or more programs for food fortification or supplementation. But all that said, in almost every country, there still is room for improvement and additional work to be done. In the context of Ghana, for example, there were wheat in 2009-10, the oil and wheat flour fortification was made mandatory. But when they went back and checked in 2017, there were still fairly substantial proportions of women and children that were deficient in iron and vitamin A. So still lots of work to be done. The next question is, why bullion? Why do we want to focus on bullion? Well, there are several reasons. One is that it has huge reach, at least in the countries in West Africa. It has huge reach, and I'll give you an example of that in a second for Nigeria. The size of the cube, the bullion cube, and most bullion comes in the form of cube, allows it a lot of space in a sense to include micronutrients. So it's much easier to put micronutrients in bullion cubes than it is in the context of, for example, salt. The scale of production is almost always large scale, and sometimes very large scale, which is exactly the scale of production that you want when you're thinking of large scale food fortification programs. They're most cost effective, and they're the easiest to monitor and manage. And in some sense, the train has already left the station. There was lots of voluntary fortification that has already begun, but it's totally unmanaged. And a lot of governments, Nigeria in particular, wanted to begin to kind of lay the groundwork for managing this process of the voluntary fortification of bullion cubes. Here's an example from Nigeria of the reach of various fortifiable and fortified products in the context of Nigeria. And what you can see is that essentially everybody in Nigeria consumes bullion or something made including bullion, a soup or a sauce or something like that, almost every single day. And the Q1 through Q5 are the income quintiles. And you can see that the poor and the richest in this country consume, in terms of frequency, basically the same amounts. And so this makes bullion a very kind of tempting vehicle for conveying micronutrients. And as I said, the voluntary fortification train has left the station. These are from West Africa, and what you see is that more than a few companies have already started to add iron and vitamin A, in addition to the iodine that's already included in the salt that they use in producing these products. That said, there's quite a bit of gaps in our knowledge. before we can actually move forward and push hard on the potential fortification of Bouillon. There are lots of kind of technical issues, how many and how much of different fortificants can be included. There are commercial issues involved. Can we actually come up with a commercially viable multi-fortified Bouillon cube? There's issues of efficacy. Does it actually work? There's issues of impact, very country-specific issues regarding impact. There are questions about the cost and cost-effectiveness of this particular delivery vehicle. And there are programmatic considerations to be dealt with. How do we actually weave this new vehicle and associated policies into existing programs? And finally, the coherence with other sorts of public health objectives, in particular sodium, which is a huge issue. What we're going to be talking about primarily today are the UC Davis contributions, and we were involved in all of these, but we primarily focused our attention on these. Efficacy, which was an RCT, a randomized controlled trial that Raina will talk about. Impact, and this is the modeled evidence, country-specific modeled evidence that I will then talk about, and the cost and cost effectiveness of Bouillon as a potential delivery vehicle for multiple micronutrients. The squeaky wheel, I'll call it that, in this. When you start with Bouillon, one of the things you realize is that it is 50% salt. And that puts it in kind of unwelcome company in among a lot of stakeholders who are really trying to deal with the fairly dramatic overconsumption of sodium in the context of many of these populations that we are working in. So this is something that we had to deal with, both in terms of data collection and in terms of kind of policy engagement from the very beginning. And we'll tell you a little bit about how we manage that moving forward. This is the collection of organizations that participated. This was a very large operation and the most diverse that I've ever been involved in. We had country working groups that were created in order to be the interface between the international community and the policymaking communities in 3 countries. We worked primarily in Nigeria, Burkina Faso, and Senegal. Helen Keller International was instrumental in dealing with programmatic issues. There were some technical groups, CSIRO in Australia and the RISE group in Northern Europe did a lot of technical work, laboratory work. The Heister group out of France was very helpful and took the lead in kind of assessing commercial viability and interacting with the industry folks in this. And the industry folks were at the table, and these were very big hitters. Nestle, Unilever, GB Foods out of Spain, BASF, and DSM. They were at the table all the time. And in fact, in pre-meetings, these exactly were the folks at the table with the Bill & Melinda Gates Foundation before they even decided to move forward with this. Because at the end, it is the industry that will be fortifying these cubes if you move forward with something like that. And so you needed to have some upfront chats with them about their willingness even to explore. And they were willing, and they stayed at the table to do the explorations. In terms of evidence generation, technical evidence from CSIRO and RISE, but UC Davis was primarily focused on doing the clinical trial and the modeling, and Groundworks out of Switzerland did the work on sodium intake. It's hard to know where to put this particular slide in, so I'll put it right. We have stakeholders out there and we need to interact with them, but who are they? What do we deliver to them? When and how? And in order to do that, you really have to identify sets and subsets of these folks. And clearly policymakers and those who advise them are one fundamental group. Industry was another huge player here. The implementing partners needed to be involved. You had to convince UNICEF that this was a good thing to do, for example. Civil society needed to be involved, and of course the donors as well. And each one of these groups had different evidence needs. And they used them for both internal discussions among themselves and also, kind of group interactions. And so one of our big jobs was to kind of take the questions and the concerns that they had, synthesize and sharpen these, and then basically turn them into research questions that we could answer either via RCTs or via modeling or some combination of the two, based on data that was available or data that we would go out and collect. And so this is kind of the sequence. It's a busy diagram, but it really did guide our thinking and our actions in terms of interacting with very specific stakeholder groups along the way over the 5-year program. The complete collection of stakeholder questions were this, and not every stakeholder posed these questions, but one or more certainly did. And I think all of them benefited from hearing the answers to questions that even they did not pose. And the first was, what's the problem? It may be self-evident to the nutrition community what the problem is, but industry had no clue. And it took some convincing, A, that there was a problem, B, that they could do something about it. Why bouillon was a fundamental question, very noisily posed by some groups. And then what can bouillon do? And then more specifically, what can bouillon do for the consumers in my country? Because it was very clear that, every country had different diets, and even within countries, there was a lot of variation in diets and consumption of quantities of bouillon consumed. So what would be the benefits to a particular area or a particular subgroup of the population? And then, what should be included in this premix? How much, will bouillon fortification programs cost? Because nothing is going to be free. And who will be called upon to pay these program costs? And that was a really fundamental question, even for the folks who were dealing with the high-level management of this project. Is bouillon fortification efficient? And if you get positive or encouraging answers to all of these, then will bouillon fit into kind of existing fortification programs? For example, Nigeria already has 5 vehicles that deliver vitamin A. So how do we deal with that in the context of discussions of multi-fortification of bouillon? And finally, but most impactfully, if we decide to move forward, what do we do? What are the activities that somebody needs to do in order to move forward? So I'm going to turn it over to Raina now, who will show us the answer to the question, what can bouillon do, more specifically in the context of the RCT in Northern Ghana. So I will end my showing and I will stop my sharing, and Raina, over to you. I think.
All right, thanks, Steve. Hopefully, do you see the right screen? Okay, great. Okay, so I'll be talking about just one of these specific types of evidence that was a piece of what went into all of these discussions. So we have it very generally framed here as what can bouillon do. So more specifically, that's referring to what is the evidence for efficacy of this strategy for improving nutritional status and related outcomes. And this type of evidence is really important because randomized controlled trials in particular for nutrition programs are one of the key types of evidence that are considered when developing global guidance. So for other types of nutrition interventions, there are many different trials that have been conducted to establish what outcomes they impact, among which populations, or testing different versions. And none of that exists for bouillon previously. And so while we have reason to believe that putting nutrients in this specific vehicle would work in terms of improving nutritional status, this hadn't been tested at all. And so that was the goal for this. So, so the main objective of this trial was to assess the impacts of household use of this multiple micronutrient fortified bouillon cubes containing 6 nutrients compared to control bouillon cubes that contained iodine. So essentially making the bouillon with iodized salt. And the site for this trial was in northern Ghana in the Kumbungo and Tolone districts. So University of Ghana and Professor Seth Aduaforoa in particular were really key partners in this, along with Newcastle University and Penn State for vitamin A assessment. So as we think about how the different types of evidence fit together, we sort of frame this as a proof of concept in that this is the first trial testing the impacts of this food vehicle on these outcomes. So our primary outcomes were hemoglobin concentrations and biomarkers of micronutrient status. And then we had a number of other secondary outcomes that we were interested in. But in this case, that we wanted to test the effects of this intervention in the context of, you could think about it as high potential to benefit. So a study site that was selected based on existing information showing that prevalence of nutrient deficiencies was high, people commonly consume bouillon, and testing a product that had micronutrient concentrations that we thought would provide a significant contribution to micronutrient requirements. So that's the conditions that we're aiming to test. And we undertook really extensive process of developing the fortified bouillon cubes that were used to answer this question. The planning process for this began in late 2019. So we were definitely affected by the COVID-19 pandemic. But some of those delays were actually kind of opportunities to spend a lot of time on the formative work. And we were fortunate that this was supported by the partners and the funders also. So the first step in this process was to determine a non-proprietary formulation for the cubes that would be tested. So for research purposes, this was not a cube that was a specific brand. That was developed by the Bouillon Consortium members. And then our group determined the initial amounts of micronutrients to be added to the cube through modeling of dietary intake data, review of the literature, et cetera. And then throughout this process, we were also able to consider all of this other work that was being done in parallel that Steve alluded to. So in particular, some of the work at CSIRO and RISE regarding sensory properties of the food and how that's affected by micronutrient addition, also micronutrient stability. It was important to confirm that it was actually technically possible to manufacture cubes with this amount of nutrients included, because this just hadn't been done. This was really, this is a food vehicle where there's very limited prior experience in fortification. And then we did quite a bit of pilot research in Ghana as well at the study site. So following this development process, we also tested the acceptability of these fortified bouillon cubes among women in their households in northern Ghana at the trial site. So we tested an unfortified version, or one that would be equivalent to producing the bouillon with iodized salt only. We tested the version that contained our target concentrations of the 6 micronutrients. And then because of some questions about a technical feasibility and sensory impacts, we also tested a formulation that just had lower amounts of those same nutrients. And so the results of this study were really clear that all of these formulations were well liked by the participants. The households took them home and cooked with the cubes for 2 weeks. We found that they used them in similar amounts, regardless of which formulation they were provided. And we also saw reassuring results in terms of micronutrient stability when they were stored at home. So this work was really critical to the trial preparations and ensuring that we had something that people would actually want to consume. At the same time, I think this study was also really helpful for discussions with the broader group of stakeholders, because the development process stimulated a lot of conversation around all of these technical issues around bouillon fortification. So moving to the trial itself, this slide shows a simplified version of the design. So this was sort of a straightforward 2-arm randomized controlled trial where individuals were screened. We then randomized at the household level. And so households were provided with rations every 2 weeks of bouillon cubes with 2 different formulations. So either with iodine only, which would be, again, the standard if they're made with iodized salt, or the multiple micronutrient fortified version. And then to test the impacts on nutritional status, then we collected biospecimens from specific household members who would be vulnerable to effects of micronutrient deficiency. So in particular, women, young children, and then among lactating women, we're also interested in the micronutrients that end up in the milk. So we tested those before and after the intervention period. These households were visited every 2 weeks throughout this period to continue providing rations and collecting information on adherence, et cetera. So after delays due to COVID and others, so this study was implemented beginning in January 2023 and through July of last year. And throughout the study, we shared updates with the consortium. We found that adherence was quite high, which was important for our results interpretation for the trial, but then also kind of relevant more broadly as questions continue to come up about feasibility of bouillon fortification and what levels might be possible. We also had pretty high completion rates for the study. And so in total, we have approximately 600 people in each of those target groups that completed the study. So since then, the team at UC Davis, University of Ghana, and other partners has been working really hard to analyze all of these thousands of samples and enormous amounts of data. So I'm not going to present all of the detailed results here, and the team is busy preparing manuscripts with all the details. But this is a snapshot of some of the very preliminary results that were shared with consortium members and stakeholders prior to the outcome of some of the policy discussions in Nigeria. So what we saw early on were a reduction in moderate to severe anemia among the women, but no impacts on overall anemia or anemia among children. We saw some modest improvements in some aspects of child development, and also improvements in milk vitamin B12 concentrations. So we still have a number of other laboratory and data analyses that were ongoing. And in a typical research study, we might finish all of this first and write the papers and then be thinking about dissemination. But this project has really had a focus on stakeholder engagement from the beginning. And so we've been committed to kind of updating the consortium as we have results available. And so along those lines, one channel providing those updates has been the convening of what we call the Dissemination Advisory Group, or DAG. So this was formed in response to this challenge of thinking about how we interpret the information from this one trial in the context of discussions that are happening in other countries and regionally. So it's not a new question at all for research, as we have to think about the generalizability of this study, and especially because it's one study, and where are the results generalizable, or how might the results look different in different contexts. So it's not new, but it's very important for this project. So we convened representatives from each of the 4 countries that were involved in this project, with the goal of having this whole group develop a really detailed understanding of the study methods, how it's implemented, to have these discussions around the generalizability of this evidence. So what does the results for the trial in this specific region in Ghana mean for Burkina Faso or Nigeria or Senegal, for example? And then also to talk a little bit about how different types of evidence fit together. So how can we use evidence from this trial along with some of the modeling that Steve will show in a moment? So we found that that this group was quite active and generous in sharing their time to discuss these issues with us. And this is an ongoing activity. So this is a group that continues to meet virtually. We have separate sessions managed in English and in French. And our really key interaction was a site visit to the trial site in November of 2023. And this is where the members of this group got a chance to be very familiar with the operations of the trial and drafted what we refer to as multi-level dissemination plans. So this is essentially thinking about activities at the country, the regional, or the global level, and reflecting their guidance on some of the issues that Steve mentioned before. So which stakeholders might need which types of evidence and suggestions for the format for providing that type of evidence. So we've found that having this one channel and having these members also serve as resources for other kind of interested stakeholders within each of their countries has been a really valuable way to engage. So with that, I will turn it back over to Steve to talk more about other activities with the project.
Okay, thanks, Brina. Now let me re-engage here. Sharing screen one, wonk, and so. Okay, we now shift from what can Bouillon do in the context of an efficacy trial to answering the question that every single person posed, which was, hey, we're not Ghana, we are Nigeria, we are Burkina Faso, we are Senegal, and what can this fortified bouillon cube do for the consumers in my country? And if we agree that it can do something, which are the micronutrients that we should include and at what levels in the premix for my country? And this requires basically generating estimates of the needs and the expected benefits of alternative bouillon fortification in the context of specific countries, again, all of which had at least a couple of fortification programs in place already. In order to do this, we had to rely on modeled evidence, and we used the Minimod model, the version of the Minimod model that made use of household level HCES data. And we also linked with the folks at Johns Hopkins University to use the LIST tool to translate effective coverage, an indicator of nutritional kind of outcome or success, into child lives saved. And I'll show you how what some of the results of these are. The Minimod tool, just in a very brief nutshell, has three components to it. The first component uses secondary or primary data, if you have it, to assess dietary intake. And once you know the requirements, then you can identify the proportion of a population that has inadequate intake of particular micronutrients. And then you can go on to use the tool to experiment by adding micronutrients to things that we already know that people are consuming, for example, bouillon cubes. The second component of the Minimod tool is focuses on costs. There's no such thing as a free fortification program, and depending on how you design it and implement it, the cost can be very different across different scenarios. So we generated a model that allowed us to estimate the cost of alternative bouillon fortification formulations. And then we can basically compare the relative cost and cost effectiveness of alternative formulations, both existing and hypothetical. And then the third part is to take all of this information and put it into an economic optimization model that will basically sift through the thousands of possibilities and identify the most cost-effective combinations of micronutrients in fortification programs, given cost constraints or subject to what you actually want these programs to achieve. One of the things, and I'll just very briefly I'll go through a couple of the types of results, the evidence that was generated by these modeling activities. What you see here is for folic acid for 3 countries that were participating in this study: Burkina Faso, Nigeria, and Senegal. And this is folic acid for dietary folic. It dietary assessments based on initially no fortification of bouillon. So the zeros in each one of these cases would be an unfortified bouillon cube. And as you move from left to right, it increases the amount of folic acid included in a bouillon cube. And what you see, several things clearly. Number one is, wow, there are very different kind of baselines depending on the countries. In Senegal, situation was much worse in terms of the prevalence of inadequacy. Nigeria, much less so. And Burkina Faso in kind of an intermediate position. What you can also see is the variation across socioeconomic groups in terms of levels of inadequacy. And then finally, you can see what the impacts of, or expected impacts on inadequacy would be of higher levels of, including higher levels of folic acid in each one of these countries in the context of bouillon. And finally, what you see is that in some countries, you don't have to add much to actually essentially do away with this particular public health problem. We also always keep an eye on the risk of consuming above the UL, which in almost all cases, with the slight exception of this one in Nigeria, really is not an issue. But it was a discussion point always among many stakeholders, and so we needed to generate the evidence to calm them down and let them know that fortification at the levels that we were modeling didn't present any major risks of consuming above the UL. Many stakeholders wanted subnational views. And so what we're able to do is to take the data that exists and assess the national on the left and then subnational prevalences of inadequate intake of folate based on the basic diets to begin with. And then the diets plus the two, in the context of Nigeria, fortification programs, wheat flour and maize flour that actually are delivering fairly substantial amounts of folic acid. And then to run our hypothetical experiment. What if we had a bouillon cube that was delivering 15% of Codex NRVs for women of reproductive age, and the industry was 75% compliant with that standard. And what you see is that basically this particular public health problem in this particular context essentially disappears. The other thing that we realized right off the bat is that while nutritionists and the nutrition community were happy to discuss things in terms of nutrient adequacy and things like that, most stakeholders didn't have any idea what that meant. And it was really hard to get buy-in around some of these kind of nutrition-based indicators. And so for the three micronutrients that do have impacts on child mortality, we did separate calculations, again, in two cases using the LIST tool, and in a third case, folic acid, we do calculations outside of that. But what you see here, and I'll put up all three of them so you can see them all at once. This is the top row is for zinc, the middle row is for vitamin A, and the final row is for folic acid. And what you see are in a sense the kind of dose response a particular micronutrient, in this case zinc in the top row, and what its impact will be on child life saved. Where the upper level, and this is the total number of children who die, whose deaths would be attributable to deficiency of any one of these micronutrients. And the bottom line is this orange line is what existing programs are already contributing to reducing that. And what you can see is that depending on the micronutrient and depending on the country setting, you get a very different answer to the question, wow, what will the impact be of higher levels of concentration of a particular micronutrient in a fortified bouillon cube? And this was very important because there was this focusing on child life saved was extremely useful in discussions with all stakeholder groups. They all riveted in on this, and buy-in was almost immediate. The next step is to identify what the costs are, who will pay these costs, and whether, in fact, this is an efficient way forward. And in order to do this, we had to do some additional modeling. In this case, it was the modeling of large-scale food fortification programs in general and bouillon programs in particular. We used an activity-based approach over a 10-year time horizon, in part because we needed to give the bouillon program time to mature. This is not something you can just start in a day. There was about a 2-year assumed startup program that then would begin to generate nutritional and other benefits starting in year 3. The bare bones of this, and here are some summary notes on costs, and this is for a particular bouillon cube that delivers 30% of Codex NRVs for the 5 micronutrients that we were dealing with. And what you can see first is that the amounts that have to be produced are dramatically different. And these are driven primarily by population size and consumption habits. And so where all you need is maybe 10,000 metric tons per year for Senegal, you need 240,000 metric tons for Nigeria. This is a very, very big number. Consequently, the costs are very different across these different country contexts. And cost per unit is not per unit of bouillon produced at that level doesn't differ much because the fortificants are essentially the same by design, but the cost per consumer can be very different depending on the amounts of bouillon that in fact are consumed. Perhaps most importantly is that the cost share is hugely determined by the premix, and that basically 93 to 95% of all bouillon costs are going to be are going to be comprised of the premix. And what emerges are a series of kind of patterns, even though there are differences across countries in each one of the fortification programs. And these are cost figures associated with bouillon fortification only with each one, looking at each one of these micronutrients separately. Iron turned out to be the most expensive. The most cost-effective was folic acid, and the other micronutrients tended to be kind of in that intermediate range where the absolute differences varied across countries, but the patterns remained more or less the same. Now, one of our major challenges was to take the literally thousands and thousands of results that emerge from all of this modeling activity and distill it into, in this case, 9 or 10 points that we could use for discussion in the context of our policy work and policy engagement work. And this is an example of what we did. And this is on the horizontal axis, we have the total number of child lives saved over the 8-year period during which the bouillon cubes would be assumed to be delivering benefits, and the cost per child life saved. And these clustered fairly neatly for discussions into 3 groups. Number 1 was those that included no vitamin A, which tend to be expensive, but also tend to do a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of child life saved. One that included some vitamin A and also some zinc and folic acid, and then a cluster that was out here that included fairly large amounts of vitamin A, and therefore the kind of the relative impacts on child life saves would be higher as well. And this was very, very useful in a lot of our discussions because it really focused on, okay, here's 10 things that you could do, and not 10,000, and then to go and send people off and just ruminate on that. Key findings from the modeling: significant dietary inadequacies. That wasn't a great surprise, but we were able to generate fairly concrete fortification programs in place. Bouillon was widely consumed in all 3 of these countries. Bouillon fortification has a potential to actually contribute fairly substantially to reducing some micronutrient deficiencies, and it may help improve the equity in diets as well. some of these micronutrients can save child lives, and that was a really important kind of talking point for us. And really, no stakeholder was baffled by the measure of success and was really committed to it. These programs may be costly, depending on what you put in them in terms of premixes. And it seems to be a fairly cost-effective delivery vehicle for many of these micronutrients, and does dovetail nicely with with all the existing programs that each one of these countries already had in place. There's a whole bunch of scientific outputs. I won't dwell on this. You'll get a chance to look at this later if you want. The real challenge after this is once you have evidence like that, what do you do with it? And this was a real challenge that we faced, and we began to face it right at the very beginning, because I said, trying to predict what we needed and then shape the research, and especially shape the delivery process and the packaging of evidence was an ongoing process throughout. And UC Davis did the trial and the modeling, and technology work was done, CSR and RISE, and all of this had to go into kind of the discussions that were ongoing about guidelines for fortification. And this is where HKI was of fundamental importance. They really were the ones who identified, what are the entry points? What sorts of things need to be changed by whom in order to move forward with at least a voluntary program for fortification. And there were standards involved, there were health and safety regulations, there were labeling requirements, all sorts of things that, frankly, we weren't aware of any of the nitty-gritty details, or the people who managed those discussions. And so we had to bring those folks into kind of stakeholder discussions and present to them, so that they would see the value, the potential value of bouillon fortification, and actually go about making the needed changes. And as I said at the very beginning, this happened on September 17th, 2024, just last fall. The Standards Organization of Nigeria actually signed off on these 2 5-page documents, which was a huge policy win. Now, you might not know, but there are no researchers involved in the gala events. This is standard operating practice, and we take pride in having kind of communicated with all of these folks and convinced them that this was an important way forward. The stakeholder engagement, we had several approaches and different channels, often managed by the Helen Keller International, the country working groups. We had Minimod in-country teams to help develop models, the bouillon consulting meetings periodically, and as Raina mentioned, the dissemination advisory group. We generated literally thousands of products. We had presentations, we made huge evidence bases with slide decks, including up to 150 slides that basically reported in a fairly distilled way all that we had discovered, especially the modeled evidence. And then we periodically got requests to, hey, we've got 150 slides, we need 3. Which ones should we use? And so we worked with them to make sure that they had the evidence that they needed, and we produced some technical briefs as well. One thing that was fundamental and exhausting sometimes was the repeats. We had to repeat these messages over and over and over again, and we had to pay attention to the extent to which our messages were actually being absorbed. And many times they were not. And so we had to make adjustments to make sure that we could get the focus right and get the engagement we wanted. Long list of challenges that all of you have probably faced, including the distance and time differences, languages. We had to do much of this in 2 languages, French and English. Raina and I spent lots of time at 1 o'clock, getting up at 1 o'clock in the morning to participate directly in online meetings with folks in Nigeria. And again, there was just a lot of turnover. There's at least 5 different kind of changes that happen to fundamental groups like the country working groups. And every time a new participant came in, you had to go back and convince them that, hey, what can Bullion do for you? Should you push this forward? What concerns about sodium and all that sort of stuff. And so there's a lot of circles involved in the presentation and the engagement. Finally, we distilled these ingredients to success is at first and perhaps foremost, you need a complete set of national and international stakeholders from the beginning, and you got to keep them there all the time. And that is really a non-trivial challenge. You need to be laser focused on the policy change or changes that you want to get done. And you have to develop and code it. And for us, it was development and codification of standards for multi-fortification of bullion. There are thousands of other things we could have made suggestions on, but we really needed to stay focused on that. We had a narrow focus geographically, 3 countries. And to be honest, the final lap, we spent much of our time on Nigeria, which was kind of a better bet in terms of securing the policy changes that we were hoping to do. We generate and delivered, all the evidence that these folks needed, and some was surprising to us. Why did you need to know that? I thought everybody knew it already, but in fact, we needed to do that. And some stakeholder groups were more interested in and benefited more from different types of evidence, but it was produced and delivered to everybody. We got to be ready to provide information and evidence many times and in many different ways. And got to manage these new stakeholder groups, sodium intake in particular. We had to do some side studies to identify bullion's contribution to total sodium intake in each one of these countries. Turns out that it's not such a big deal, 15 to 20%, which is non-trivial, but it makes bullion kind of a part of a national program for sodium reduction and not just a villain to be avoided in discussions of multi-fortified delivery vehicles. You got to be flexible when it counted regarding the policy objectives. Initially, the stated objective of this program was mandatory fortification. Given the time frame and the process at which that sort of thing would evolve, we had to shift, and we were happy with the codification of voluntary standards, which is the first step in actually moving towards mandatory. This is the entire group, this is the UC Davis crew. This is a very large proportion. There are literally hundreds of people who participated, especially if you count the field team in Ghana that was responsible for undertaking the trial. But there were many people in the bullion working groups, the Minimod working groups, Helen Keller International, folks from each one of their offices, plus the and then all of the other folks around here. A shout out, of course, to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that supported much of this. Okay, that's it. We are done here with the presentation. I will now stop sharing if I can do that. And there we go.
Thank you so much. That was, I am amazed at how many people, groups were involved. And the timeline didn't seem that long to me, from like the start to the actual like tangible impact and result. So it's an amazing project, and one that we are all proud to say happened at UC Davis. So we're going to open it up for questions. We have a few minutes for questions. Filomena Gomez is asking, for countries considering bullion's fortification and multiple micronutrient supplementation during pregnancy, do you think there would be a significant risk for pregnant women? Maybe Reina can take that one.
Sure, thanks. So I think it's an important question, as this keeps coming up, as Steve had alluded to. The situation in Nigeria is one example of countries that already have a lot of programs, and then so these questions about what if we have more. I think in the case of pregnancy, nutritional needs are so high. I think, that there are limitations to what large-scale fortification is going to be able to do to meet those. And so I think certainly the fortification alone would not be meeting those, I guess is what I'm saying, and that those supplements would probably fill an important gap. I think in terms of the risk side, I think, maybe advocacy for monitoring what nutritional status looks like would be the way to go to identify, if you might be approaching that. But I think, again, what the bouillon is providing is unlikely to be anywhere near, those really high needs during pregnancy would be my guess.
Thank you, Reina. Really appreciate it. And I have another guest with me. For me, it's 7:30 p.m. time in Portugal.
Happy to have some diverse audience.
All right, we have a question from Kenneth Brown. Thank you for joining us. Are the major BC suppliers moving ahead with fortification as recommended, and what steps will be needed to move them from voluntary to mandatory fortification? That's a great question.
Yeah, very good question. There is a pathway, there's a known pathway, because this is not the first program of fortification that has been finally in the end codified as mandatory. So the next step is to basically help the medium scale producers, and in Nigeria there are a fairly substantial number of them who will, who want to comply as well, but they don't have the technical labs and things like that that the very big players have. And so they need technical assistance in figuring out how to get 15% of Codex. And there were the voluntary fortification does not include vitamin A. It includes 4 micronutrients, 4 other micronutrients that we worked at 15% of Codex NRV for an adult consuming 2.5 grams. And so that is the standard. And the fortificants, there's an array of fortificants that can be chosen. And so we were helpful in trying to identify the cost and cost effectiveness of some alternative choices in terms of fortificants for particular micronutrients. And so that's moving forward. They will probably spend, I'm guessing, about a year of technical assistance, and then they will kind of reconvene and see, and this is the Standards Organization of Nigeria, and see whether, moving ahead with the 15% of those 4 micronutrients is the desired way forward, or whether any sort of changes need to be made to the micronutrients to be included or the levels. And so I'm guessing probably a couple of years before this kind of goes through that entire process. One of the big challenges, of course, is in order for any voluntary program, to work, there has to be some sort of monitoring program in place that the government has to do. And a lot of these developing country governments, and not only them, have face challenges in kind of establishing kind of commercially level playing fields for to actually implement that framework if and when they go to mandatory. And that's a big challenge. And that's one of the, certainly the producers are saying, hey, if I'm going to do this, then everybody else who's going to be doing it alongside me has to actually play by the rules. And that's a big challenge. And the Nigerian government is, and the other governments that we're working with as well, are moving that discussion forward.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I had a question. You were showing that graph with the effect of kind of like the number of child lives saved per fortification, and they're like very dramatic differences from country to country. And I don't know if you cover that, but why are those differences so dramatic? Is it just because the baseline is so different of the need for fortification?
Yeah, there's 2 major things. One is population size. I mean, Nigeria is huge compared to the other 2 countries, and so any even a small percentage of lives saved in Nigeria turns out to dwarf the other countries. But second, and your intuition is exactly right, it depends on baseline diets. And some of these countries have worse or are in worse situations than others. The consumers are worse than others in terms of their needs. And so, and that doesn't always work the way you would kind of intuit, is that if they're really, really bad off, then, Bouillon might not be able to lift as many individuals out of dietary inadequacy as in other countries where their diets are a little bit better. So bouillon in Burkina Faso, for example, is less impactful across the board than bouillon in the other two countries, and that's primarily because the dietary situations that we start with in the context of Burkina Faso are much worse, and it's just harder. It's a heavier lift to get people above these thresholds of nutritional adequacy.
Okay, and I'm going to ask you one last question because we're over, but I'm very curious about if this process can be applied or can be generalized as a blueprint for how to address these challenges in other regions and with other nutrient deficiencies. If there's an effort to try to kind of come up with a blueprint for this type of work.
Reina, you want to tackle? I'll start tackling it, and then Reina can follow up. One of the big things, we have a paper that's coming out that kind of chronicles the policy engagement process that we went through. And one of the things that we ask ourselves at the end is, hey, if you didn't have the kind of support that we had and the involvement that we had with major international companies and stuff like that, what could you hope to accomplish? And so in many ways, we benefited from things that most researchers don't benefit from. 5 years of time to work, a lot of resources put into this, the RCT as well as the modeling, and kind of the participation wasn't mandatory, but the participation of all of the major players who produce these cubes. They were at the table every time we sat down. I mean, who has that kind of access? Almost nobody. And so it probably wouldn't be very useful for us to characterize this as a blueprint, because replicating this in other countries might be very, very challenging. Reina, over to you.
I would agree. I think, yeah, in the context of maybe other problems or in other contexts, I think every case would be different. What are the problems, and who are the stakeholders, and what are the issues that are coming up? I think, yeah, Steve noted there are probably some things that are in common, like having a longer time frame. I mean, it's not going to happen in 1 year, even 5 years. There's a way it's a long time, but it's a long time for a research project, but it's a short time for some policy changes. So having the time, having the resources, and then the kind of the coordination to have all of these different stakeholders, as aligned as they can be, I think. So maybe those are some common ingredients to success. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't want to end on a negative note. This can't be done if you don't have 5 years and $10 million or whatever, and have Nestle or whoever with you. I think the framework is good in the sense that the approach we took, the seeking out the stakeholders, and coming up with ways to identify the evidence that they needed and then deliver that in a way that they could understand and use. Is the proper framework. And we learned a lot about how to do that. And it was a very kind of nonlinear process. And that paid huge dividends, I'm sure. And so anybody doing anything with almost any level of support can take that framework and apply it as best they can.
Thank you. And I think with that, we're going to wrap up our session for today. And I want to thank our speakers again for a very inspiring presentation, and to thank them for representing UC Davis in the international stage with such an impactful and feel-good result and project that we all need recently. So have a wonderful weekend, and we hope to see you in our next session in a couple of weeks. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks very much, everybody, and thanks for the invitation.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.